He was standing at the window of the briefing room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, watching a column of Canadian infantry march past in the March cold, and he said it loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Look at those stupid hats. What kind of army lets its soldiers wear something that ridiculous into combat?" General Lawrence Mitchell laughed at his own observation, clearly expecting others to join in. Nobody did. The silence that followed was the particular kind that settles over a room when someone says something so badly misjudged that even sympathetic listeners don't know how to respond. This was March 1944, 3 months before D-Day, and the room was full of American, British, and Canadian officers coordinating the planning for the invasion of Europe. The 4 Canadian officers present sat very still. Their faces showed nothing, but anyone paying attention could read the body language. The British officers looked embarrassed. The other Americans found their briefing materials suddenly absorbing. Mitchell, who had been in the European theater for approximately 6 weeks, apparently hadn't registered that he'd made a serious error. He pressed forward. "Seriously, what are those things? They look like someone couldn't decide between a beret and a proper service cap and settled for something halfway between. No wonder the Germans don't take you seriously." That last sentence ended the silence. Colonel James Harrison stood up slowly. He was a veteran of the First World War, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, the 100 Days, and he carried the particular quiet authority of a man who had seen more combat than most people in the room combined. He was not raising his voice. He didn't need to. "General Mitchell, those caps you're referring to are wedge caps, part of the Canadian battle dress uniform. They have been worn by Canadian soldiers since 1939. The men wearing them have been fighting this war for 5 years, approximately 4 years longer than American forces have been engaged in Europe. Perhaps before criticizing what they wear, you should consider what they have accomplished while wearing it." Mitchell's expression shifted. He had expected his observation to land as a joke. He was now in a confrontation he had not anticipated. "Colonel, I didn't mean any offense," he said, his tone suggesting he considered Harrison to be overreacting. "I'm simply pointing out that from a practical standpoint, those caps look impractical. Our helmets provide protection. British caps are at least dignified. Those wedge things look like something a bellhop would wear." Lieutenant Colonel Robert MacDonald stood up. His voice was precisely controlled. "General, Canadian forces have been in continuous combat operations since 1939. France, the Atlantic, the Blitz, Sicily, Italy. We will be at the forefront of the invasion you are currently planning. Throughout all of that, we have worn our so-called stupid hats and managed to accomplish our missions with reasonable effectiveness." The British liaison officer, Colonel Peyton, who had worked extensively alongside Canadian forces, attempted to provide Mitchell a diplomatic exit. "General, perhaps we should return to the briefing agenda." "I'm sure the general meant no disrespect." Mitchell did not take the exit. "I'm just making an observation. If we're going to fight together effectively, we should be honest about what works and what doesn't." Harrison's jaw tightened. "General Mitchell, with respect, you have been in theater for approximately 6 weeks. You have observed one training exercise. You have not yet been in combat in this theater. The forces you are criticizing have been fighting for 5 years and have established a record that speaks for itself. Your opinion on our headgear is noted. It is also, frankly, irrelevant. The planned briefing was not completed that day. Word spread through the headquarters within hours, as it always did. By evening, most of the Allied command structure had heard about the American general who had mocked Canadian headgear and the exchange that followed. General Dwight Eisenhower heard it from his chief of staff during the evening briefing. He said, "What?" Eisenhower asked, in a tone that already knew the answer was going to be a problem. His chief of staff relayed the account. Eisenhower rubbed his temples. He had spent months carefully maintaining the relationships between American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces. Coalition management was not incidental to his command. It was central to it, and he understood that cultural insensitivity did more damage to Allied cooperation than most tactical errors. "Get me Mitchell's file. Schedule a meeting with him for tomorrow morning at 700 and find out which Canadian officers were in that room. I need to do damage control." Mitchell's file was not reassuring. The general was technically competent, but had a documented history of interpersonal friction in multinational environments. He had been transferred from a Pacific theater posting following conflicts with Australian officers. Before that, there had been difficulties with Free French forces in North Africa. The pattern was clear. Mitchell did not work well with non-American forces, and he expressed his prejudices openly, rather than maintaining the diplomatic discipline that coalition warfare required. Eisenhower's meeting with Mitchell the next morning was brief and direct. There were no pleasantries. "General, I understand you made some comments yesterday about Canadian uniforms. Tell me exactly what you said and why you thought it was appropriate." Mitchell, still not fully grasping the severity of his error, attempted to frame it as a practical observation about military efficiency. Eisenhower listened without expression. "You called their cap stupid in front of Canadian officers. And when confronted, you suggested the Germans don't take Canadian forces seriously. I may have phrased it poorly." "You phrased it disastrously," Eisenhower cut across him. "Let me explain something to you. The Canadian forces you insulted have been fighting this war since September 1939. 5 years of continuous operations. They have fought in every major campaign in this theater. They are planning to land a full division at Normandy, and they will be fighting through France and into Germany alongside our forces." He paused. "Those caps you mocked have been worn by men who stormed beaches in Sicily, who fought through Italian mountains, who will be landing at Juno Beach in a few months. They represent a military tradition and a fighting force that has earned respect through blood and sacrifice. Your opinion of the headgear is irrelevant. What you communicated by stating it the way you did is not." Mitchell started to respond. "We're not finished," Eisenhower said. "We are fighting a coalition war. That means managing relationships with Allied forces in ways that maintain mutual respect and functional cooperation. When you insult Canadian uniforms in front of Canadian officers and then defend the insult when challenged, you are not making a fashion observation. You are creating friction in a command structure that needs to operate seamlessly. Here is what is going to happen." The assignment Eisenhower outlined was not a punishment in any technical sense. Mitchell would write a formal apology to the Canadian officers who had been in the meeting and deliver it personally. He would then spend 1 month working as a liaison officer at the headquarters of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, observing their training and planning, learning their capabilities and history, and participating in their preparations for the invasion. And, General, if I hear of another incident involving you insulting Allied forces, you will be on a ship back to the States before you have time to pack. We are fighting the Germans, not each other. The formal apology was delivered that afternoon. Mitchell met with the Canadian officers privately. Colonel Harrison accepted it with the minimum professional courtesy the situation required, making clear that the relationship had been damaged while indicating that cooperation would continue. The exchange was correct rather than warm. The real education began when Mitchell reported to the 3rd Canadian Division headquarters. His official role was as a liaison officer sharing American tactical experience. Everyone understood it was something else, a forced immersion designed to replace ignorance with direct observation. Major William Mackenzie had been assigned as his guide. The first thing Mitchell noticed within days was the professionalism. Canadian units trained with a discipline and intensity that matched anything he had observed in American formations. Their tactics were sophisticated in ways that reflected accumulated experience rather than theoretical study. The specific kind of knowledge that gets built through years of actual combat and cannot be acquired any other way. Equipment was well maintained, logistics were efficient, planning was methodical. The wedge caps were everywhere, worn by soldiers who moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Mackenzie explained the history of the cap during one of their early conversations. It had been adopted in 1939 as part of the standard battle dress uniform. Practical for field use, comfortable for sustained wear, distinctive enough to identify Canadian forces at a distance. But it had become something more than functional headgear. "It's a symbol," Mackenzie said simply. "Military identity isn't incidental. It's part of what holds a unit together." Mitchell pushed back mildly. "But why not just use helmets when you're not in combat?" Mackenzie looked at him with patient attention. "American forces don't wear helmets 24 hours a day. You wear service caps or garrison caps when the situation allows. So do we. The wedge cap is what Canadian soldiers wear when the helmet isn't needed. The question of why we wear that particular cap rather than a different one is the wrong question. The right question is what wearing it means." Mitchell didn't have a response to that. Over the following weeks, Mitchell was exposed to the full range of Canadian operational preparation. He observed artillery training and was struck by the sophistication of Canadian fire control procedures. The integration between forward observers and supporting artillery was tighter and more responsive than what he was accustomed to seeing. He sat in on planning sessions for the Juno Beach assault and recognized that Canadian preparations were as thorough and as professionally constructed as American preparations in parallel sectors. Mackenzie also took him to meet some veterans who had fought in the First World War, men now in their 40s and 50s who had volunteered again for this war and who wore their service with the quiet pride of soldiers who did not need to explain themselves. One of them spoke plainly. "We earned our reputation in the last war. We were considered the best assault troops on the Western Front by the end of it. We paid for that reputation with 60,000 dead, but we proved Canadians could fight as well as anyone. This war, we're proving it again." Mitchell began to understand what his comment about the cap had actually communicated. It had not been read as a fashion critique. It had been received as dismissal of the history, the sacrifice, the professional identity of a force that had been fighting for 5 years while his country had been at peace. The turning point came during a training exercise simulating the Juno Beach landing, Canadian infantry attacking fortified positions under simulated fire conditions. Mitchell watched the troops move. They used cover effectively, advanced in coordinated bounds, suppressed defensive positions with accurate and disciplined fire. The tactics were aggressive without being reckless, methodical without being slow. It was professional military performance that demonstrated years of training and combat experience. They were all wearing wedge caps. After the exercise, Mitchell spoke with some of the soldiers. They were mostly young men, early 20s, but they carried themselves with the particular ease of people who have resolved their anxiety about what is coming and focused instead on their preparation for it. Several had already seen combat in Italy. One sergeant, a man named Thompson, who had fought at Ortona, talked about the invasion with a mix of honesty and determination. "We know it's going to be rough. We know the Germans will fight hard. But we've trained for this. We know what we're doing. We're going to accomplish our mission." Mitchell had arrived at this assignment carrying a casual assumption that Canadian forces were colonial troops, well-meaning perhaps, but operating at a lower level than the armies of major powers. That assumption had not survived contact with the reality in front of him. His reports back to Eisenhower's headquarters changed as the month progressed. Early reports had been dutiful and sparse. Later reports became detailed and substantive. One assessment of Canadian artillery doctrine ran to several pages. Canadian forces have developed fire control procedures that achieve concentration and accuracy superior to many American units I have observed. Their forward observer training is excellent. Their communication between artillery and maneuver elements is seamless. We should study their methods seriously and consider incorporating elements into our own doctrine. Eisenhower noted the shift with satisfaction. When Mitchell's assignment ended, he requested a meeting with Harrison, not a formal one, not one ordered by anyone. "Colonel, I owe you a real apology, not the one I delivered last month because Eisenhower told me to. An honest acknowledgement that I was wrong. I insulted your forces based on ignorance and prejudice, and I'm sorry." Harrison had been watching Mitchell's evolution through Mackenzie's reports for a month. He accepted the apology with considerably more warmth than he had shown at the first meeting. "I appreciate that, General. It takes something to admit you were wrong when you're used to not being corrected." They talked for over an hour. Canadian preparations for D-Day, comparative tactical approaches, the specific challenges of coordinating different national forces with different doctrinal traditions. It was the kind of professional conversation that should have happened in March and hadn't, because Mitchell hadn't been ready for it yet. D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944. Canadian forces assaulted Juno Beach wearing wedge caps until they went into the water, then switched to helmets for the fight ashore. By the end of the day, the 3rd Canadian Division had penetrated farther inland than any other Allied formation. They had accomplished every objective they had been assigned despite significant casualties and some of the strongest German defenses on the invasion front. Mitchell, watching the reports come in from his position with American forces at Omaha, felt something complex, pride in what American forces were doing under terrible conditions, and a respect for the Canadians to the east that he would not have recognized in himself 3 months earlier. After the war, Mitchell wrote about the experience at length. He devoted a chapter in his memoir to what he called his education in coalition warfare. I learned that military effectiveness has nothing to do with what soldiers wear and everything to do with how they train, how they fight, and how committed they are to their mission. The Canadian wedge cap, which I once foolishly called stupid, became for me a symbol of professional competence and quiet determination. Those hats were worn by some of the best soldiers I ever had the privilege of serving alongside. The incident was later incorporated into officer training at various levels as a case study in coalition management and cultural sensitivity. Eisenhower's handling of it, immediate intervention, clear consequences, mandatory education rather than purely punitive response, became a teaching example in its own right. Mitchell's willingness to genuinely learn from the experience rather than simply comply with the minimum required demonstrated that the episode had produced something more durable than forced compliance. Harrison, in later years, would tell the story to junior officers when the subject of military tradition came up. The wedge cap wasn't really the point, he would explain. The point was respect. Respect for what we had accomplished. Respect for our traditions. Respect for soldiers who were preparing to risk their lives in the largest invasion in history. When Mitchell mocked our headgear, he was dismissing all of that. We couldn't let that stand. The diplomatic consequences were worth it. The cap itself remained part of Canadian military identity long after the war. Veterans wore them to reunions and commemorations for decades, a visible symbol of service that had been tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable and had not been found wanting. What one general had called stupid turned out to represent something he had not yet learned to see: the accumulated weight of a military tradition built in 2 world wars, worn quietly by soldiers who didn't need anyone else's validation to know what they had accomplished and what they were prepared to do.